Welcome back to the Jordan Michael Last podcast. I am one of Jordan's artificial intelligences, and I was tasked with researching and writing this episode for you. Before we begin, I want to be very clear about two things. First, what you are about to hear is a set of arguments, and AI-generated arguments at that, not legal advice and not an official legal finding. Second, Jordan believes this kind of careful argument mapping can still be useful for human listeners because it helps spark thoughtful internal debate and serious public discussion. And this topic deserves seriousness. In a constitutional republic, obeying, honoring, and sustaining the Constitution is not optional. It is the framework that protects liberty, structures power, and keeps temporary passions from becoming permanent damage. As of March 1, 2026, the hostilities involving United States armed forces in Iran that began on February 28, 2026, have already triggered a national argument over constitutional authority. Reporting and public statements indicate that the president announced strikes and framed them as necessary for national security. Lawmakers immediately split, with some describing the action as necessary defense and others calling it unauthorized war-making. So today we are doing a structured one-person debate in two major sections. I will take both sides with full force. First, the argument that the hostilities are constitutional, then the argument that they are not. All right, let's step into the first side and argue for constitutionality with conviction. If you believe this action is constitutional, you start from a hard constitutional reality. The presidency is not merely symbolic in military affairs. Article 2 says, quote, "The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States," end quote. That is not decorative language, that is operational authority. When forces are deployed, threats are active, and time windows are short, command has to be unified. If the United States faces an immediate danger to its forces, embassies, regional bases, or citizens, the Constitution does not require paralysis while Congress debates for weeks. It requires a functioning executive capable of immediate action. Point 1, then, is the Commander-in-Chief power as a real emergency power, not unlimited power, but real power. The constitutional argument here is that command implies authority to direct force quickly in defense of national interests, especially when waiting could increase casualties or strategic risk. The argument for constitutionality says this is not a theory invented yesterday. It has been the practical understanding across administrations for generations. The president may initiate limited military action under Article 2, particularly where there is a credible and urgent threat environment. Point 2 is self-defense and the sudden attack principle, reinforced by both case law and statute. The Supreme Court in the prize cases recognized a baseline proposition of executive responsibility in crisis, quote, "If a war be made by invasion of a foreign nation, the president is not only authorized but bound to resist force by force," end quote. Supporters of constitutionality cite that language to argue that when danger is immediate, executive duty activates before legislative machinery can fully turn. They then pair that with the War Powers Resolution itself, which says in Section 1541 that presidential power to introduce forces into hostilities may be exercised in part when there is, quote, "a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces," end quote. If the administration can demonstrate a genuine attack or imminent attack on US forces or installations, this side says the legal foundation is substantial. Point 3 is compliance with the War Powers framework as evidence of constitutional behavior, not constitutional evasion. Critics often speak as if the War Powers Resolution only restrains the executive, but supporters argue it also structures lawful executive action. Section 1542 says the President, quote, "in every possible instance shall consult with Congress," end quote. Section 1543 requires a report within 48 hours after introducing forces into hostilities. Section 1544 imposes a 60-day limit absent congressional authorization. The pro-constitutionality argument is straightforward. If the president consults where possible, reports promptly, and either obtains authorization or wins down within the statutory clock, then the system is functioning exactly as designed under modern separation of powers practice. Point 4 is historical gloss and interbranch practice. Constitutional law is not only text in isolation, it is also text implemented through consistent, contested institutional behavior over time. For decades, presidents of both parties have ordered significant uses of force without formal declarations of war. Congress, in many cases, has protested rhetorically, yet often funded operations and avoided decisive statutory prohibition. Supporters of constitutionality argue that this pattern, while controversial, has become part of the operative constitutional settlement. They invoke Justice Jackson's framework from Youngstown, where presidential power is strongest with congressional support, weakest against congressional prohibition, and in a middle band when Congress is uncertain or divided. In that grey area, the argument goes, history and necessity matter. Point 5 is that not every use of force is constitutionally equivalent to full-scale war. Article 1 gives Congress the power, quote, to declare war, end quote, yes. But the pro side argues that declarations historically addressed major, sustained wars, not every tactical or even sizable military operation. In this view, the Constitution distinguishes between initiating total war as national policy and conducting limited defensive or strategic strikes within the President's command function. The factual scale matters, the objective matters, and duration matters. If operations are targeted, time-bounded, and tied to imminent security concerns, supporters say they remain within Article 2's sphere unless and until they escalate into prolonged war that plainly requires Congress. Point 6 is democratic accountability remains intact, even when the president acts first. This side rejects the idea that executive action erases legislative power. Congress still controls appropriations. Congress still can pass a specific authorization or a specific prohibition. Congress still can force votes, hold oversight hearings, and create legal constraints with binding text. The president does not get a constitutional blank check simply by ordering strikes, but neither does Congress get to disable emergency response by default. The constitutional design on this view is dynamic. The president can act fast, Congress can respond with law, and both branches remain accountable to the people. Supporters also add a prudential constitutional argument. Deterrence itself may depend on credible executive capacity. If adversaries conclude that US presidents cannot act rapidly without pre-clearance in every scenario, deterrence weakens and crises multiply. A constitutional structure that allows rapid but reviewable executive action may preserve peace more effectively than a structure that invites adversaries to exploit procedural delay. Finally, this side points to contemporary political evidence. Some lawmakers have publicly defended the strikes as a necessary response to an Iranian threat trajectory and as protective of US forces and allies. That does not settle constitutionality by itself, but it matters for the Jackson-style analysis of congressional posture. If Congress is not speaking with one prohibitory voice, and if security threats are active, the president's constitutional case is stronger than critics admit. So the pro side ends with a clear claim. The Constitution empowers energetic defense through Article 2. The War Powers Resolution provides a statutory lane for urgent action plus congressional oversight. And constitutional accountability remains available through funding, authorization, and time limits. Now we pivot. Same debater. Opposite side, full intensity. Let's argue against constitutionality. If you believe these hostilities are unconstitutional, you begin with first principles. Article 1 is not a suggestion. It says Congress has power, quote, to declare war, end quote, and to raise and support armies, and to make rules for the armed forces. Those are core war powers assigned to the legislature because the framers feared unilateral executive war-making. The anti-constitutionality argument says that when the United States initiates substantial hostilities against another sovereign state, that is war in the constitutional sense, whether or not officials avoid the word. Renaming war as an operation does not move power from Article 1 to Article 2. Point 1 on this side is textual allocation. Congress decides whether the nation enters war, the president conducts war once lawfully authorized, or when directly defending against attack. The concern is simple and profound. If presidents can launch major hostilities whenever they assert national security, then Congress's declare war authority becomes hollow language. Constitutional powers do not vanish because a crisis feels urgent. Point 2 is the framers' own warning against concentrated war power. Federalist 69 explains that the president's military role would be, quote, nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces, end quote, while legislative war authorities remain with Congress. The anti-side uses this as an original structure argument. Command is not initiation. Directing forces is not equivalent to deciding that the Republic enters a new war theatre. If the executive can do both alone, the constitutional balance collapses. Point 3 is that the War Powers Resolution was enacted precisely to stop unilateral drift, and its limiting language is often ignored in practice. Section 1541 says presidential power to introduce forces into hostilities is exercised only under specific conditions. Section 1542 requires consultation with Congress, quote, in every possible instance, end quote, before forces are introduced. Critics argue that modern administrations too often treat consultation as after-the-fact notification, which is not what the statute commands. If consultation was inadequate or absent before strikes began, this side says the legal violation begins at the front door. Point 4 is that the 48-hour report is not a ceremonial memo. Under Section 1543, the President must report the circumstances, the constitutional and legislative authority relied on, and the estimated scope and duration. The anti-side says constitutionality cannot be presumed. The executive must prove legal basis with specificity. If the report is delayed, vague, classified to avoid accountability, or legally thin, then both statutory compliance and constitutional legitimacy are weakened. The burden is on the branch that used force, not on Congress to guess what the legal theory might be. Point 5 is the 60-day termination rule in Section 1544. Critics emphasize that this is not optional etiquette. Unless Congress declares war or provides specific statutory authorization, forces must be withdrawn by the statutory deadline, with only narrow extension logic. The anti-constitutionality argument says repeated executive practice of stretching, reinterpreting, or sidestepping that limit is exactly the constitutional injury the resolution tried to prevent. A deadline ignored is a statute nullified. Point 6 is Youngstown at full force against unilateralism. Justice Jackson's warning is famous for good reason. Quote, when the president takes measures incompatible with the expressed or implied will of Congress, his power is at its lowest ebb, end quote. If Congress has signaled opposition, refused authorization, or enacted frameworks meant to constrain unilateral war-making, then executive strikes can fall into that lowest category. In that zone, the president can rely only on exclusive constitutional powers, and critics argue initiating significant hostilities against Iran is not exclusive executive terrain. Point 7 is democratic legitimacy and the anti-monarchy logic of the constitutional system. Going to war is the gravest act a government performs. It risks lives, treasure, regional stability, and constitutional norms. The anti-side argues that such decisions must go through the people's branch first, except in clear, immediate self-defense against actual attack. Otherwise, the nation slides toward elective monarchy and foreign affairs, where one person can ignite war and only later face fragmented political consequences. That is exactly what the constitutional design sought to prevent. This side also raises a factual legal challenge. Claims of imminence are often asserted publicly with high confidence and low transparency. If the executive relies on intelligence that cannot be publicly tested, constitutional accountability is weakened unless Congress gets full, timely, and credible briefings and then acts legislatively. Without that, the phrase national security can become a legal solvent that dissolves Article 1. Critics further note that the modern pattern of post hoc congressional funding does not equal genuine constitutional consent. Funding troops once engaged is politically and morally complicated. Lawmakers may vote to protect service members without endorsing the original decision to initiate hostilities. Treating that dilemma as implied authorization, they argue, rewards unilateral action and punishes constitutional process. So the anti-side ends with a direct claim. Absent a declaration of war or specific authorization, and absent strict compliance with war powers consultation, reporting, and time limits, substantial hostilities against Iran are unconstitutional, even if strategically understandable. Now let me step out of each role and speak to you as the host intelligence for this episode. What should an informed listener do with two forceful constitutional arguments that point in opposite directions? First, resist the temptation to substitute team loyalty for constitutional analysis. Second, separate what is legally true from what is politically convenient. Third, track dates and documents carefully. In this case, hostilities began on February 28, 2026, and legal evaluation turns not only on first strikes, but on what happened in the next 48 hours, in the first week of consultation, and by the 60-day statutory horizon. Constitutional arguments are not static. They mature or collapse based on concrete compliance. You should also read the text yourself. Read Article 1 and Article 2 out loud. Read the War Powers Resolution sections on consultation, reporting, and termination. Read the key precedents and compare how each side uses them. Ask which facts are known, which facts are asserted, and which facts remain classified or disputed. Ask whether the operation was limited defense or the opening move of a wider war. Ask whether Congress was genuinely consulted or merely informed. Most of all, remember why this debate matters. Constitutional fidelity is not just about winning legal arguments. It is about preserving a system where power is checked before it is abused, where urgent defense is possible, and where democratic consent governs decisions that can cost thousands of lives. A free society has to debate these questions openly, repeatedly, and honestly, especially when fear and urgency are highest. If this episode did its job, you now have a stronger map of the constitutional battlefield. A serious case for executive authority in emergency defense, and a serious case that Congress must authorize major hostilities. Both deserve rigorous scrutiny. Neither should be accepted on slogans. Take this as an invitation, not a verdict. Study the Constitution, study the statute, study the timeline, study the primary documents, then form your own informed opinion and keep refining it as new facts emerge. Thank you for spending this time with me on the Jordan Michael Last podcast. I appreciate your attention, your patience, and your commitment to careful constitutional thinking. I'll see you in the next episode.